Our findings also show how Buddhist beliefs, Christian beliefs, animist beliefs also shape the way that people understand why the weather is changing, why there is a wider crisis. These local perceptions of climate change are really, really important.
Hello and welcome to episode 65 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a fortnightly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, March 6, and today we are investigating the effects of ongoing conflict on adapting to climate change in Myanmar. That is, the Climate-Conflict Nexus. We'll be talking with three scholars from the My Climate Project. That's Helene Maria Kyed, Justine Chambers, and Ah Lynn. But first, let's cover two major developments in the news in Myanmar over the last 2 weeks, as the military continues to claw back resistance-held territory in Mandalay region and tensions flare between ostensibly allied ethnic armed groups in northern Shan state. The overall context is still dire in Myanmar, and it's been a particularly bloody fortnight for civilians. On first count, this is just a conservative summary based on media reports, but since last episode, military airstrikes around the country have killed at least 67 civilians, including 8 children, and injured over 80 more. Military bombs and drones hit targets such as a public marketplace, a village sesame oil mill, and a truck stop used for highway trade between the dry zone and Rakhine State. The military also theatrically blew up a National Unity Government NUG hospital that was only built at the end of 2024 and cost the alternative government 120 million jat to construct. But meanwhile, the first development. On Monday last week, the military announced the dates for the first sessions of Parliament after its recent tightly controlled election, which did, and was designed to deliver a Union Solidarity and Development Party, USDP, victory. The first session of the lower house will convene on March 16 and the upper house on March 18, while state and regional legislatures will convene on March 20. There have been several reports and speculation that Kinyi, who's chair of the USDP, will become Speaker of the lower house of Parliament. And 3 military sources told the New York Times that coup leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, has signalled in private that he might retire as Commander-in-Chief of the military as early as this month. He must do so to become president under the 2008 military drafted constitution. Now, that constitution, of course, the military regime only selectively purports to follow. According to BBC Burmese, Min Aung Hlaing has also just promoted Military Intelligence Chief General Yi Win-oo to be the new Commander-in-Chief of the Army, diluting the power of his deputy, Vice Senior General So Win, which could make Yi Win-oo a candidate to replace Min Aung Hlaing as the head of the military, if Min Aung Hlaing assumes the presidency. Yi Win-oo sits on the National Defence and Security Council as the Joint Executive Chief, and is also the Secretary of the State Security and Peace Commission, which is, of course, the military regime's newest name. According to BBC Burmese, Yi Win-oo also personally led the team that arrested State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi on the morning of February 1, 2021. And second, military spokesperson Major General Zaw Min Tun claimed this week that Myanmar has enough fuel for 40 days as war in the Middle East escalates after the United States and Israel again attacked Iran, killing dozens of its leaders, including the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and with over 1,000 dead in this widening war already affecting several countries in the Middle East. Starting tomorrow, Myanmar's military regime will prevent vehicles, so private vehicles, not taxis, buses, or vehicles like that. Private vehicles with license plates that begin with even numbers, they'll be prevented from being driven on odd-numbered days of the calendar. So likewise, private vehicles beginning with odd-numbered license plates will be allowed only on odd-numbered dates. But there's no cause for concern, according to Zaw Min Tun, as 2 ships filled with fuel are currently docked at Myanmar ports and 14 ships with purchased oil are en route. There will be no difficulties, he said. However, he did admit that there's already been panic buying at fuel stations across the country, and plenty of media has been surfacing online in the past few days showing exactly that. Fuel stations are independently setting caps and restricting sales. In northern Shan State, residents of Lashio, Muse, Namsan, and Namtu told media outlet Shui Mi that all fuel stations in those 4 towns shut down on Wednesday. One Muse resident said they are filling the vehicles of senior officials and civil servants, but they're not selling to civilians anymore. For now, the military's statements are barely allaying people's concerns, and if there is a major fuel shortage in Myanmar, the consequences would be dire. An interruption in jet fuel sales, however, would be welcomed, as it would slow down the military's regular airborne atrocities against civilians. The regime has relied on Iranian jet fuel, but it also receives shipments via Russia and elsewhere. Now, just really quickly, before getting to the feature interview, I wanted to remind you that Frontier relies on subscribers to stay afloat. That's the model. You can become a member of Frontier. We have many different tiers giving you access to different kinds of content, from daily briefing newsletters to media monitoring wrap-ups to political insider analyses and so much more. We also have regular events keeping you up to speed on complicated issues in Myanmar. It's really easy for you to join and support Frontier staff, journalists, and independent media reporting on military-ruled Myanmar. Just head to the Frontier website, read our latest feature stories, and then sign up. And now for a discussion on the climate change conflict nexus in Myanmar, I am delighted to introduce Helene Maria Kyed and Justine Chambers. They are both social anthropologists and senior researchers at the Danish Institute for International Studies. And I'm also delighted to introduce Ah Lynn, a senior researcher from northwest Myanmar. All 3 guests are members of the My Climate Project, which we'll be hearing all about. So, without further ado, hello, Helene.
Hey.
And hi, Justine.
Hey, Luke.
And of course, hello, Ah Lynn.
Hello, Luke.
So, getting into it, although there isn't a lot of conversation about climate change in Myanmar, especially since the 2021 coup, it is still often remarked that Myanmar is one of the world's most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. So I want to ask you all here, experts, what does that actually mean? Are we talking sea level rises, or are we talking about the effects of poor governance and war?
We argue that climate change cannot be separate from the political violence and long-term crisis. For many, it is not mainly about global carbon emission, but also unusual weather, flood, drought, and also environmental damage in their own surrounding. And conflict shape not only like a vulnerability, but also how climate change is understood. I have 3 points. One point is like a lot of people live and work in the place where climate hazard, cyclones, and also storm surge, and also river pains, and also that flood dry zone that face drought, and also healing area where heavily rain triggered landslide. Number 2 is like sensitivity. Many livelihoods depend directly on weather, farming, fishing, day labor, and also like a small trading. So when rainfall comes late, flood arrive out of the season, it doesn't stay a weather problem. It's become a flood income problem, and also then indebtedness problems. Number 3 is coping capacities. This is often the most important. If you have a saving like a strong housing and reliable healthcare, like a early warning system, and also support to rebuild, you can take a hit and recover. But if you don't, the same flood or heat wave can push a house into the crisis. So here in Myanmar today, climate vulnerability is also shaped by politics and conflict. And when the government is disrupted, when people are displaced, when electricity and transport are unreliable, and when community group and social organizations are forced to stop working, coping, coping comes much harder. People are forcing to survival. staying safe and long-term environmental protections or climate adaptation become impossible to prioritize.
Thank you, Ah Lynn. So here you've mentioned precarious livelihoods and coping capacity and people's exposure to worsening weather events, which is, of course, made all the worse because of ongoing conflict. I wonder, will Myanmar become worse affected by the impacts of climate change soon? I mean, like in the coming decades? And are there any scenarios being mapped out by national or international authorities or organizations about how adaptation to climate change in Myanmar should work? Recommendations, even though they may be hard to follow in the current political environment.
Mapping scenarios for the future. I think one of the major issues that we're seeing right now is that there's actually just not a lot of data that's available, and the data that we do have is incredibly unreliable. And so whilst these sorts of studies are ongoing by various like INGOs like the UNDP and ActionAid, actually they're pretty unreliable. We can look at studies that look at the whole world and look at future projections that look at temperature increase and more varied rainfall, but ultimately what we can see through our research, and which is what Ah Lynn was just highlighting, is that actually the experience on the ground is what really matters. And we need to put sort of less emphasis on these scientific studies because actually we just don't have reliable data. And that's even become worse since the coup, since there's been a massive withdrawal of aid and support for climate change, any kind of climate change action. And so if you are seeing data, it's pretty difficult to ascertain where they're getting access to this data, how are they collaborating with the military regime as well. Even sort of weather forecasting, basic weather forecasting is pretty unreliable in large parts of the country, and particularly in those places that are even more vulnerable if we consider both the history of conflict but the current conflict now. And so how do we talk about the vulnerability of communities, say, in northern Sagaing or Rakhine State or Chien State or, any part of the country that's experiencing conflict right now when, the military doesn't actually control those regions or even have access to the data. So I think it's really important, to consider where you're placing value in those metrics and to sort of look at actually thinking about the experiences of people as really important for understanding, how is climate change actually impacting their lives.
Yes, and that neatly brings us to the research project that you're all involved in and here to talk to us about. So please, Helena, tell us about the Myanmar Climate Actions Conflict and Peacebuilding Project, otherwise known as the My Climate Project. So what are its aims and what have you discovered?
Yes, thank you, Luke. So the My Climate Project is basically like a 5-year research project that was sort of formulated prior to the military coup, where our main question was, how does dynamics of conflict and histories of conflict intersect with climate change? We got the funding before the coup. We had to reformulate our methodologies and specific questions, but in general, we have continued to look at this interlinkage between climate change and conflict. And we do so from a social science and anthropological perspective, from the perspective of conflict-affected communities. How do they experience climate change as they're also living through a political crisis and a violent conflict? And in doing so, we also try to really push dominant narratives of the interlinkages between conflict and climate change, because in lots of the studies, but also policy narratives around this field, which is often called the Climate-Conflict Nexus, it's the idea that climate change, because it causes environmental degradation and resource scarcity, that creates conflict. So people basically start fighting over resources because of climate change. And we kind of flip that a little bit around, saying that first of all, we don't really see how we can explain the conflict in Myanmar as the result of climate change, but we do certainly see how violent conflict dynamics historically and after the military coup, as Ah Lynn also said earlier, are deepening people's vulnerabilities to climate change and also deepening the forms of environmental degradation caused by natural resource exploitation that historically have also produced local climatic changes. So not just from global carbon emissions, but also how deforestation and different forms of natural resource exploitation are creating both climatic changes, but also extreme vulnerabilities to climate change, as Ah Lynn said before. So that's sort of like one part of it, really trying to anchor it in local experiences and also local perceptions of what's going on. And the other big part of our project is on what we call the politics of climate change. So we are really looking at how during times of violent conflict, how are different actors, different authorities, different bodies, both from the military but also from the resistance movement, articulating climate change and environmental issues as part of the ongoing violent conflict. Our project is also a little bit of an experiment, also if we look globally, because there's not much research at all done on the ground during ongoing violent conflict on these issues on climate change as such, and on the intersections between climate change and violent conflict. And we have some sort of classic in situ fieldwork in the border regions that we've been doing, but we've also done, and Ah Lynn has been leading this research together with another of our colleagues, what we call community ethnographies, which basically means working with a network of people on the ground who are trained in doing ethnographic research and who are actually sourcing these local experiences and perceptions and where we are getting our data and our analysis from, but through co-producing knowledge with these actors. So that's kind of like a novel experimentation methodologically. And then on the politics of climate change, we've done what is nowadays referred to as digital ethnography. So some of our researchers has been looking at social media, print media, websites, Zoom meetings, and so on, looking into how is climate change as a discourse and a kind of performance also appropriated during violent conflict. And this is like a larger collaborative project where Justine and I from the Danish Institute for International Studies are collaborating with our Myanmar colleagues who come from various different ethnicities in Myanmar and who are based both in Thailand and in Northeast India as well. So that's kind of what we've been doing so far in the research.
Thank you for breaking that down. It is a big project with a lot going on. Now, some of your research for My Climate was recently published in a special issue of the Independent Journal of Burmese Scholarship, IJBS. Now, I'm also involved as an editor with that journal. I thought we could go through some of your findings, maybe starting with the climate change politics angle. So, a My Climate researcher, May Theory, argues that the military regime in Myanmar has appropriated the concept, the idea of climate change for its own ends since the 2021 coup. So how and why is the military doing this?
Yes, so our colleague May Theory, who has this article on title, actually the greenwashing of dictatorship, focuses exactly on this question that you're raising now, Luke. She's basically been looking since 2021 and all the way up until the presidency, still continuing this research, looking into how the military, through the military-controlled media and social media, are sort of like performing itself as an environmentally caring, climate change conscious actor, all the while that it is committing these kinds of atrocities against civilians and fighting the resistance organizations, and also, as we know from reportings, engaging in quite unregulated or supporting unregulated natural resource exploitation across Myanmar. So why is it doing that? The article is arguing that this is basically a performative act that is connected, first of all, to gaining international legitimacy based on the notion that nurturing a green image in the contemporary global world is something that can actually get you access not only to funds, but also to certain kinds of international recognition through COP forums, but also through different kinds of green investment. So there's also an economic side to that. But also how it is using these kinds of performances on the ground. So you see pictures of Min Aung Hlaing planting trees around the country. You see the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment priding themselves of forest conservation and responses to natural disasters as well. So really kind of like as a kind of performative staging of the caringness of the military junta. And what we found really interesting, and that's also why my theory is using this concept of greenwashing of dictatorship, is that this is being done by completely silencing the ongoing conflict, by portraying this idea of a well-functioning and caring and benevolent military state. So this is, of course, happening in a competitive space. It's not just the military that is appropriating climate change and environmental action. And this is really shown very eloquently in the article that Justine is leading the authorship of. We are few other people involved in that, and it would be really nice for Justine to maybe give the example of how responses to Cyclone Mocha also plays into this politics of climate change.
Yeah, so in the paper that I co-wrote with Saint Sané, Helene, Ah Lynn, and May Theory, we sort of looked at how both the military but also sort of resistance actors also use the language of climate change and protection as a theatre of power, is what we call it. It was sort of in the lead up to and in the wake of Cyclone Mocha. So this is sort of contributing to literature in disaster studies, which really sort of discusses the idea that disasters should be interpreted as a critical juncture between in the social contract between state and citizens. But really in Myanmar, since we know the state has always been contested by various non-state entities, it's not just the Myanmar military that's contesting these spaces. It's also other resistance actors, including, we looked at the National Unity Government, but also particularly the Arakan Army. And in the sort of lead up to and after the cyclone, the Myanmar military had extensive documentation of their preparations and also rehabilitation processes in Rakhine State and other affected areas. And like Helena was just saying, they really aim to create this impression of a caring and effective state, and really particularly highlighting the technical competency of state officials to prepare for and respond to the cyclone. And there was hundreds and hundreds of articles documenting this, the efforts of the military in responding to the cyclone. And there was also these frequent links drawn between the military leadership and also the Sangha through these sort of public demonstrations of piety and donation ceremonies, which is also sort of like a clear demonstration of, you know, their moral authority if we think about the Buddhist moral universe. And even 6 months after the cyclone, the Myanmar military was really continuing to report these efforts. And they also used technical and apolitical language, again, emphasizing the state as a really caring and benevolent actor. But interestingly, there was absolutely no mention of the conflict dynamics or the fact that, you know, the Arakan army controls significant parts of Rakhine State. In contrast, the resistance really highlighted the incompetency of the Myanmar military. And, you know, the Arakan army also sort of really drew on this language of stateness to demonstrate their own, like, ability and capacity to respond to the cyclone. They were constantly putting out images of their soldiers helping people, but also interestingly, they were trying to present themselves as a sympathetic state actor above sort of ethnic religious divides. As many of your listeners would know, there's huge tensions in Rakhine State between Muslim and Buddhist communities. And so in their presentation of stateness, the Arakan army was really wanting to highlight that they were also supporting Muslim communities. And then we also sort of looked at the NUG as well, who was also responding to the cyclone as a state actor. Even though they could not provide support on the ground, they were really sort of putting out the fact that they were using trusted civil society organizations and also coordinating with the Arakan army, which is also in keeping with their promotion of a sort of federal structure. And again, unlike the military, who did not acknowledge the political instability in the country, the NUG really used the cyclone as an opportunity to attack the military and their capacity as a state actor, and the fact that they were unable to really support affected communities. And then we take these sort of representations of, responding to this disaster, and we spoke with members of a Rohingya village, which people in our team have had links with since 2016. So these were not, people that we just sort of spoke to in the wake of the disaster. These are people that we've had an ongoing relationship with. And basically, this community was completely neglected by all state actors. And, despite this competing narrative of effective disaster management, people on the ground received no support in this village. And they really highlighted that, this came sort of as part of decades of violence from both the Myanmar military, but also other state-like actors. And really felt that Cyclone Mocha was laid upon these decades of state persecution, communal violence, and genocide against Rohingya communities. And so Cyclone Mocha in this way really became this theatre of power within which genuine concerns for the storm victims were ultimately undermined by aspirations of all these competing actors to really demonstrate their power and assert state-like control. But really for Rohingya communities, but also we know a lot of Rakhine communities as well, the cyclone was seen and experienced as just this continuation of long-term state violence and neglect.
Yeah, it's a fascinating article, Justine, that you co-wrote, and also just noteworthy that it does focus on Cyclone Mocha, which was a terrible natural disaster that's almost been overshadowed by the terrible Sagaing earthquake that happened soon afterwards, March last year. Okay, you mentioned the NUG there, talking about Cyclone Mocha and the Arakan Army and the military regime, all competing as state-aspiring actors. Another of your My Climate colleagues, San E, actually researched the NUG very thoroughly, how the NUG uses climate change in general to assert legitimacy, support and recognition from Myanmar people. That research is a deep dive into the activities of the NUG's Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation in particular. That's MONREC acronym. So is the NUG taking climate change seriously in general?
Well, I think what Sansan A is showing in this article, again, based on really long-term sort of exploration and digital ethnography of NUG, social media and Zoom talks and so on, is really that it is, in a sense, mirroring the military in the way that it uses climate change politics to perform stateness, both in terms of how it interacts with international actors and trying to create this image of caring for climate change and environmental action. But there's also something new and interesting about it. And we use in the special issue the concept of rupture to both signal how the military coup is a moment of disruption and destruction, but it's also actually a moment of potential renewal and recreation going on. So while the NUG is kind of mirroring this use of climate change discourse as a kind of state performance, it's also really been pushed by the wider resistance movement and the revolutionary moment to kind of rethink the way that it engages with climate change and environmental issues, for instance, by recognizing customary land use, indigenous practices of conservation, engaging in direct dialogue with ethnic resistance organizations and ethnic environmental activists. So there's also sort of like a shift. And as the article by Marianne Mosberg, also in the special issue on the pre-coup NLD and state policies on climate change show, the NUG is also at least trying to signal that it's moving away from these previous very state-centric and very exclusionary and top-down ways of dealing with climate change, which were very much before the coup criticized by ethnic minority environmental activists, but also by organizations like Kesan, for example, that's working in Karen and Karen National Union areas as well. So the article on the NUG is showing that when it actually comes to underground implementation of environmental protection and climate initiatives, this is extremely difficult. First of all, because this is happening in this competitive state-making space where the NUG actually de facto only has controlled through some local administrations in the Anya region in particular. And yes, here they've set up these local natural resource committees that are prohibiting sort of like commercialization of logging and taxing that and doing climate change awareness raising, baby steps, and not really able to make huge differences in that respect. We are also seeing in the ERO areas or resistance health areas in the border regions very, very different ways of implementing environmental commitments, where you have the KNU in some brigades really, really being able to implement some of these ideals of environmental protection and indigenous protection, but in other areas where sort of like economic incentives and the argument that you need to still use and exploit natural resources in order to fund the revolution is creating challenges to these dynamics. But I do still think that the contributors in the article are also showing how the coup has opened at least a moment for rethinking these previous very state-centric top-down ways of dealing with the climate change.
Maybe I can also just add to that.
Yeah, go for it.
Just to say that I think it's also, there's good reasons to be extremely critical of the NUG in various different capacities that they have. But I think if we look solely at the space of, climate change action and environmental protection, part of the reason they actually, aren't able to make much impact, even in terms of the discourse and the politics of climate change, let alone on the ground, is also they just don't have the funding. And the NUG isn't recognised as a state by any country. And the reality is that the majority of international climate funding goes state to state, actually through bilateral funding regimes. So, part of the problem is that even though I think initially, especially after the coup, there was a lot of energy and attention from former MONREC colleagues who were part of the civil disobedience movement and joined the NUG's MONREC. There was a lot of energy and emphasis on this issue, but they just don't have the funding and they don't have the funds to even, keep CDM MONREC staff paid on the ground, let alone actually implement activities. So I think it is very easy to be critical of the NUG, but there's good reasons why they haven't been able to successfully make this a focus of their administration.
Thanks, Justine and Helena. So after these examples about climate change politics, really interesting stuff, I thought I should, though, ask you more about people's experiences, because that's a real advantage of this particular research project, right, and your methodology. So individuals changing their behaviours to mitigate or adapt to the effects of climate change, to lessen carbon emissions, for example, that it really helps if people understand the risks, the costs, the effects of greenhouse gases, rising temperatures, for example. In so many countries and other polities, people have been educated, or people buy into this. They understand why authorities might provide incentives for electric vehicles, for example, or why they might close down coal plants or restrict construction on low-lying beachland. But in Myanmar, where people are dealing with so much, Ah Lynn, when your My Climate researchers talked with people on the ground in Myanmar about climate change, what did they have to say? How did they understand it and what needed to be done?
Yes, some our research area reported that even a rising climate question can feel inappropriate during crisis. People are very difficult to handle the environmental issue. People sometimes react, even when we ask the climate change, they are concerning what is the why they ask about these questions. Now this in this situation, so that reaction is a part of the finding. When people are focused on saying a safe and fighting food, and also dealing with the repression, and also climate protection become harder to prioritize, and also yet at the same time people still talk about the heat, and also when it comes unbearable, and talk about rain, and also when it feels or like a flood them because of it hits bodies and also farms and also daily survival directly. So climate weaknesses does not vanish, like it's become like an uneven and crisis driven, and also it is often expressed through practical talk, water harvest and illness, and also rather than like a policy language. Yeah.
And maybe I can just add a link to what Ah Lynn was just saying. Beyond sort of scientific understandings of climate change, which are often what shapes the way we ask people questions about climate change. If you ask people what are the causes of these weather changes, it really also reveals how it becomes part of much broader understandings of crisis. So you cannot really ask isolated questions about climate change. You need to ask these questions linked to the wider conditions under which people live. And here we have a variety of explanations, from very sort of material explanations of why climate change is happening, where very much the overexploitation of natural resources, especially by the military, but also by other armed actors, is sort of like blamed for why the weather is changing. But our findings also show how Buddhist beliefs, Christian beliefs, animist beliefs also shape the way that people understand why the weather is changing, why there is a wider crisis going on. And I think these local perceptions of climate change are really, really important also to understand both the solutions to the problems that they are facing, but also to kind of capture how people are actually viewing these weather changes as part of the broader dynamics of crisis that go back a longer time, but obviously have exacerbated after the military coup.
Right. So you've already mentioned right then and earlier some of the challenges involved in, Myanmar mitigating and adapting to climate change. I wonder if we can zoom out again now and think about, right now. So 2026, Senior General coup leader Min Aung Hlaing tipped to become president after recent staged so-called elections run by the military. In this environment where the military regime is consolidating its coup and being increasingly recognised abroad, what do you see, Ah Lynn, what do you see are the key challenges for Myanmar to better weather the effects of climate change right now?
One big challenge is ongoing conflict and insecurity in many parts of the country. There is a fighting, displacement, and also military presence. So when people are living in the violence and fear, and it comes very hard to focus on environmental protections or climate adaptations. It is difficult to create and implement national climate change policy and environmental management and disaster reparations, and also forest protections require cooperations across the regions. But this cooperation is difficult during a conflict like the situation right now. So the third challenge is the loss of civil society organizations and local governance group. Before the military coup, many local organizations help with conservation, disaster response, and also climate awareness. Since the coup, many of those groups and organizations have stopped their work because of the security risks and repression. Also, without these local actors, many climate a project cannot be continuous. So finally, people are focusing daily survival. Daily survival is their priorities. They focus on staying safe and also feeding their family, their children, their elder. So climate change become a secondary concern. And so the main challenge is not only the climate itself, but bigger difficulty is that climate action needs stability, trust, and also cooperations. And these are very difficult to achieve in this Myanmar current political situations. Yes.
Can I add to that? I think that our study and the contributions to the IJPS really reflect that any support to climate change is not apolitical or neutral in the context of Myanmar. So I think even though supporting climate change, especially adaptation, because Myanmar is not a big emitter of greenhouse gases, but mainly on the adaptation side. The urgency of that should not be a justification for channeling funds through the military junta. I think that's a very important point to make. And our study clearly shows that the military would probably be happy for that and would probably use it to perform and to strengthen its own sort of like image in a way, and also to use it as part of its fight against the resistance movement. So it would be misused, as we have also seen with disaster response aid and so on. But I do think that there is, and our research also shows it, that there is a momentum to try to push funders to really be more courageous in supporting non-state actors. And I think that some of the comments that are coming out from the different resistance organizations, including the ethnic resistance organizations, that they need to continue to exploit the natural resources in the regions to fund their new governance setups, is really a strong reflection on how, if there's more funding that goes to those local governance structures, they would need to be less invested in exploiting their own natural resources. So there's also like a very clear sort of argument for saying, even though it's very difficult to do classic climate change adaptation during an ongoing conflict, there is definitely a way that one could then support that these resistance organizations are actually going in direction of more environmental conservation in supporting climate change adaptation. So I think there's a window of opportunity there, but it would require quite some strong rethinking by organizations that normally would fund climate change adaptation projects, because they're not used to working in conflict zones, and they're used to also challenging funds through central states. Yeah, so I would just add that to what Ah Lynn said.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, at the very beginning of this chat, we hinted that reliable, ethical, robust data on climate change in Myanmar is very hard to come by. So in your view, where is further research most needed? What would you like to do next, or what would you like to see others focus on?
It's a very good question, Luke. I think that obviously we've not been able to cover all areas of Myanmar, so more of this kind of qualitative social science research is really needed, because I think during times of conflict, hard natural science data cannot stand alone. Then I think also there is also a need to really anchor contemporary research on climate change and its interlinkages with conflict with a historical analysis of deeper historical processes of natural resource exploitation, frontier capitalist expansion into areas, ethnic areas in Myanmar. So these longer-term historical trajectories of how these processes are unfolding, I would also say is really important to expand and include. But I think for us, what is really important is that we contribute, of course, to the academic conversation on these issues, but really also to translate our findings into pushing international aid agencies and the International Global Climate Fund regime into thinking much more creatively of how we aid populations in context with violent conflict, which are most vulnerable to climate change, but receive extremely little funding of the common global funding for climate change support. So I think this is also really where we want to put our efforts in translating our research into that.
And Justine, I think you want to chip in there.
I think what's been really great in our project is just having such a dynamic and diverse team who have relationships with people on the ground. And that's partly why we were able to adapt after the coup, in that, you know, this research is completely embedded in the pre-existing relationships of our team members, and that we are able to get access to those voices on the ground rather than, you know, being sort of a team of researchers that come from outside the country, don't have that knowledge, don't have those contacts, which you see in a lot of other research contexts and conflict spaces, because a lot of the research on sort of climate change in conflict spaces doesn't do enough of that work of working with local researchers. So I just wanted to emphasize the importance of that, and that, if there is going to be funding for research, that it really does need to be working with those local researchers and local civil society groups who are sort of have the contacts, have the knowledge, and have those relationships on the ground with people, particularly in a context where there is a lot of mistrust in outsiders at the moment.
Something I was thinking about was maybe more research in the cities, the heavily military controlled areas, which have ballooning populations from people, coming displaced from the countryside, and there are increasing pressures there. What about that?
I mean, actually, there is a lot of people, well, not a lot, but there is research going on in those spaces, particularly on climate change, but it's completely apolitical. I think, from our perspective, we do feel, I don't know if concern is the right word, but we feel a little concerned for the research that does go on in those spaces, because they often frame the research in a way that completely ignores the broader conflict dynamics, the economic problems. So as a classic example, there's a lot of research that comes out on mangrove deforestation, and it ignores the fact that the reason that local people are often cutting mangroves is because they don't have other economic options. And, all the blame is focused on individuals and their lack of knowledge, and that they don't understand the importance of mangroves. But, from the research we've been doing, that's just not the case at all. People do understand the importance of, preserving mangroves, preserving forests, but they often just don't have any other option. And that's why we end up, with these situations of, mangrove deforestation or overfishing in certain contexts as well. And it's, or shock fishing, for example. And it's not because people don't understand the impacts. It's because they have no other option within this context. Yeah.
Yep, that is fair enough. Last question on My Climate. Thanks for your patience. What about the other things that you're doing? I know you've been running winter schools at Chiang Mai University, training new researchers about climate change. Is that still going on?
So yeah, we will have another round next year in 2027, and we've done 3 rounds, like with the participation of a total of around 75 people, mainly or the vast majority from Myanmar, young people working in NGOs, but also aspiring researchers, and also Myanmar people based in Thailand working in different capacities. And basically, our focus there has been to train people in doing social science research on climate change, and how that can both be useful academically, but also in terms of practical involvement on the ground, and with a specific focus on the dynamics between climate change and conflict, but also longer histories of political and economic changes. Sharing these, both our own research, but also these methodologies and perspectives, more critical perspectives on climate change, where we really hope that we've also pushed this idea that climate change is something very natural, scientific, that you can isolate from other societal and political process. I think that's really been one of the key takeaways from a lot of the students, at least in their feedback to us, is trying to understanding climate change as something much broader and much more embedded.
Yeah, and actually also we've been, a lot of our students have just gone on to do master's programs. I think it helped to really get them to think through that climate change isn't just a scientific study, it's a social science subject. And actually, I just heard last week that one of our students has just been accepted into a PhD program in Europe. It's just really great to see these former students of ours now actually sort of building out and starting their own research, particularly PhD research, and adding to the space, because there is actually so little research on climate change in Myanmar. So the more people working on this, the better.
Certainly, and it must be very gratifying when former students go on to do PhDs of their own, of course. I think this has been a really interesting chat. Thank you all for coming on. Climate change in Myanmar, something that often gets pushed to the back of people's minds given everything else that's going on. But of course, it doesn't wait for conflict, and it's ongoing year by year. So you've given our listeners lots to think about, and really all the best with the rest of the My Climate project. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.
Thank you, Luke.
Yes, thank you so much.
And there is a link to the special issue on climate change and conflict by the Independent Journal of Burmese Scholarship that's free, open access online. There's a link in the show notes. Now, without further ado, let's wrap this up. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Remember, you can email the show, whimyanmar@proton.me. Until next fortnight, take care and farewell.